Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo and Cryptids encounter stories. First story. This story was shared by u/testicles620. My experiences as a crime scene cleaner. To start out, you need a little backstory to show how I got into this situation. When I got out of high school around 2003, finding a job was difficult, so I took whatever horrible jobs I could to get by. When I found a job cleaning fire and water damage full-time, I was excited to have steady income and start saving, but this quickly turned into a nightmare that I had to endure for almost 2 years. The company I worked for put me on my first job, which was a water damage claim where a basement flooded with sewage, so after a few days of work we finished and it was on to the next job. My boss then called me into his office the next morning and told me about a special crew that he was setting up and asked if I would be the crew leader supervising 3 other guys that were just hired. I found this strange as I had only been working there a total of around 3 days, but figured my work ethic was already paying off and I would get a raise. I only made $10 an hour to start. Not only did I not get the raise, but I got no training in the new position other than a work van with cleaning material, and the phone numbers for the 3 new guys that also were hired in to do fire/water damage cleanup. The boss told me what tools were best to use and what cleaning products to use to sanitize, along with where everything was located in the van, with hazmat suits and respirators, but he was vague about what kind of things I would clean up. He just said the situations were always different and I would get detailed instructions each job. He called my position CSC crew leader. The boss told me that I would never have to see the deceased as the coroner would have the remains gone by the time my crew got there, and to use my logic to determine what needed to be removed from the homes and what could be cleaned. The first job I had in my new position, which the boss told me about when I got to the office, was cleaning up the remains of an elderly man or woman who died in their house and had been laying in chair. When we arrived, the coroner had me come inside to show me a few things that were considered hazardous material and needed to be removed due to the risk of disease. I guess my boss knew a few people from the county coroner's office and much of the work came from their recommendations. Not only was the deceased still in the house, but was fully visible to me and the other guy, and you could smell the rot through the masks as the house had no AC and this was mid-June. The coroner was backed up and waiting on additional people to show up to load the body as it was falling apart, and I called the body it because I honestly couldn't tell if it was male or female and was trying not to look too long as it was disturbing. The other 3 guys I worked with handled it well, but 2 got sick from the smell and has to go outside to puke. We all waited outside after the coroner showed us the chair, the fluids that leaked into the carpet, and the basement where the fluids went through the subfloor and puddled on some boxes in the basement. The coroner's support arrived and took the deceased out, and me and the crew started working. After about 5 minutes, weird things started to happen, the first of which was when I began to disassemble the chair. I had removed the back of the chair and was putting it into the special hazmat bags that I was given, and the base started to rock when I was about 10 feet away, putting the bag with the back of the chair by the front door. Nobody else was in the same room as the other guys were in the basement dealing with moving boxes. I brushed it off and took apart the base of the chair as much as I could, and when I got it into the bag I got a chill up my back and then began feeling sick. I just figured it was the shock of what I was cleaning hitting me and pushed on, even though the chill was strange as I was very hot in full hazmat in June. Next was removing the carpet and assessing the floor to see if it would be able to be cleaned or if I had to remove a section of the floor. So I called the boss to ask him, and he told me just to pour the special cleaner on the area to soak into the floorboards and it would be fine, so I got it out of the truck where he said it was and brought it inside. When I got inside, all 3 of the guys in the basement were scrambling to get out of the basement, tripping over each other, and all three ran outside. When I asked them what was up, all three said there was someone in the cluttered basement and they assumed it was a homeless person or junkie. Detroit has many issues with these kinds of things. I listened at one of the open windows to the basement. It's kind of the first thing we did when we started working, open any window possible, prop the doors open, so maybe someone got inside then or possibly before we got there and was hiding. After listening a few minutes and hearing nothing, me and another of the workers went inside, armed with a mag light and a piece of metal fence post, and searched the basement. Nothing was down there but the footprints of the shoe covers we used, but when we started up the stairs, we heard a horrible hacking cough from somewhere in the basement. When we looked for it, there was nothing, but the corner of the basement had a bunch of dust stirred up like someone was moving things very recently that weirded us both out. We called the guys back in and they got back to the boxes, but all of them kept feeling like they were being touched while throwing away material from the boxes that got fluids on them. I went back to my upstairs job but found that the cleaner I put next to the floorboards was gone, and I started getting frustrated as it was the only jug I had of this cleaner, and I clearly remember it being set next to the area before the guys ran up the stairs and my attention was redirected. I began to take out trash figuring I would find it eventually, or the basement guys took it for the floor, and I found it on its side, behind the bag that had the back of the chair. This is impossible, there were like 6 other bags in front of this one near the front door, and this was a gallon bottle of cleaner. Again I got a chill, but this one was brought on by what sounded like a whisper that I could not make out the words to. Cleaned the floorboards and moved out trash, job complete. That night each member of my crew had a dream about an older man telling us that we are not welcome in his home, touching his belongings, and we need to leave. In my dream I was alone in his house. The old man cried and told me I was destroying his things and he couldn't replace anything. He was trying to push me out of his house, but it was like I was ignoring him. Even when he would push me and scream at me, no reaction from me. He then threw my cleaner into the garbage pile I had made by the front door, exactly where I found it. 2 of the 3 guys in the crew told me their dreams about the old man pushing them as they went through boxes of ruined pictures and other old stuff that needed to be thrown out due to the risk of disease from his fluids. They also said it was like they had no control and were on autopilot. They said they were so sad but couldn't do anything. The thing that got me about the dreams of the other 2 guys was they both said the man was getting so upset that he began violently coughing, and that the man kept grabbing their arms when they would touch boxes or throw things into the trash. Neither of the guys were in the house when me and the other guy heard the coughing from the basement. The guy that went into the basement with me said he had a dream, but all he remembered was waking up sad like he did something wrong, and had a horrible coughing fit, which might just be a coincidence, but I connected it in my mind as relating to the other dreams. We all talked about it and came to the conclusion that we were all just having a reaction to a situation and it was nothing more than our brains coping with what we had to do. I'm very into psychology, so I rationalized it the best I could and we hoped for better assignments the next day. Next few jobs were not so bad, cleaning up blood at a home invasion, no casualty, but huge mess. Then there was a few other bloody crime scenes with casualties, but nothing notable happened. About 2 weeks into the job we began to learn the tricks of the trade and were split into 2 different groups that I was responsible to manage as crew leader, so I would have to go to different sites if the other 2 guys had an issue or didn't know what to do. I thought I was getting used to the job as well as the other guys as we had no other experiences like the first job, but I was wrong. The next job that there was activity was a suicide of a man that was middle-aged. The coroner had already removed the body, but it was a mess. The guy had shot himself with what I think was a large caliber handgun or shotgun, as the spray was everywhere in the basement in like a second living room. There were skull fragments lodged in drywall, brain matter all over, and again he was not found for a bit, so the smell was horrible. First step in cleaning this was using our backpack vacuum cleaner to suck up all the biomaterial. The coroner told us when we went in that he and his partner were extremely uneasy in the house and it felt strange, and we immediately started getting a claustrophobic suffocating feeling when we went into the basement as well. To make matters worse, the family of the man had came over and were crying upstairs, but the vacuum noise helped to cancel out that. While I was cleaning, the power to the lights went out and it was completely pitch black. This was strange because my vacuum was still powered. My crewmate started screaming at this point, so I turned off my vacuum and climbed off my ladder. I thought maybe he touched a wire to the lights, but when my vacuum unit was turned off he was still screaming and I could hear things being knocked over. I started fumbling around for my flashlight on my tool belt and yelled for my friend asking what was going on, but all I got back was panicked screaming. Then I saw in the pitch black, something darker that was moving in my direction, and I will admit, I freaked out. I slipped trying to back up, still looking in my belt for the flashlight, and found it when my back hit the basement wall. I turned on the light aimed at the blackest shape I have ever seen, and when the light turned on, I saw the shape of a man wearing a flannel shirt, beard, and an expression like he was about to attack me. Then it was just gone. My crewmate was behind where the entity was, sitting on the floor rocking with his hands on his head. When I approached, he picked up his flashlight off the ground and turned it on, then ran up the stairs and outside and threw up. I followed behind him, asking if he was okay and why he was screaming. I thought I just imagined the entity and the man because his screaming scared me, but he told me that he was scrubbing the wall and felt something pulling on something in his tool belt and he thought it was me, but when he turned around, the lights went out and he was engulfed by what he said was like dark smoke, and he immediately could not breathe and was struggling to move. He managed to pull his flashlight out, but it was knocked out of his hand like his wrist was grabbed with force, and he managed to scream. When he screamed, trinkets started falling off an entertainment center that was about 3 feet to his side, and the black smoke moved back, but he was close to passing out from exertion. He also said he lost hearing and didn't know that any noise came out when he started screaming, and that the stuff falling off the shelves was landing on him, and that's why he was covering his head. He said it felt like a weight was lifted off him when the dark smoke backed up, but he felt sick right away, and the light from my flashlight made the sick feeling increase. We took an early lunch where he just sat there, pale as ever, and didn't say much other than he said he breathed in that smoke and didn't feel right. I got him some Gatorade and his color started to come back. I never told him I saw a man when I turned on my light because we still needed to finish, and I didn't want to put that in his head since he never mentioned seeing it. When we went back, the lights in the basement were on again, half the things that fell from the shelves were back on the entertainment center, and the TV was on baseball. There was also a different smell in the room, similar to burnt hair. My worker stayed a half hour, got sick again and went home for the day, leaving me alone to finish, which I didn't want to do but had to as the other guys had their own job. After cleaning up everything with my vacuum, I began scrubbing the old blood, which is hard after it congeals, mix in brain matter, and it is like glue, even with cleaner. While I was finishing up, I kept seeing the shape of a person always in the side of my vision. Each time I would smell that strange burnt hair scent, and a few times, I also felt like a force was pulling at items on my belt, not sure what item as there were several things in my belt. When I finished the job, I went to use the bathroom upstairs, and in the hallway along the way I heard like muffled crying or moaning. I froze up and stayed still thinking maybe a family member had came back, and when I panned around, there was nothing, but I saw a picture on the wall of a man with a beard wearing a flannel, several other pictures in the hallway of other scenarios of the same man, different flannels with deer or fish or family. I had not seen a picture of that man as I had not been anywhere else in the house with a bathroom, nor did I use the bathroom downstairs because pulling off the hazmat stuff is a pain. As I was securing the house, closing all windows, locking doors and shutting down every light but the front porch light, I saw the front curtain move and again saw the darker than black form in the front window. The last experience I will share in this thread happened mid-July in a very bad area in Detroit. There had been an incident where a guy supposedly tried to abduct a child, was stopped by people in the neighborhood who beat the man very bad and he escaped to his house where the neighborhood people quickly called police and civilians surrounded the man's house to prevent escape. The police response time in this area is horrible and the people were throwing rocks through the man's window and damaged his car. The man was hurt bad by the mob and was hurt by a rock or glass and died in the home. This is assumption by DPD. From what the police officer told me, it was a misunderstanding and the man picked up a girl that was injured riding her bike and some kids that knew her told their parents that the man was kidnapping her and people overreacted and the man was brutally beaten. The cleanup was pretty simple to do. We secured windows, cleaned up blood and bodily fluid, but as soon as I entered the house, I just felt wave after wave of fear and sadness, like I have never felt this before, and it hit in waves that made my legs weak. My working buddy who was there showed up late and didn't get the story from the cop like I did, but experienced the same feelings I had. The whole time we were there, we saw a form darting around corners, like it was watching us, then hiding. It was similar to like a small bit of fog or mist. We also heard very slight cries for help coming from several areas in the house and also what sounded like, "Please stop," and long, "No." A few times the crowd came back and yelled at the house also, and when this was going on the activity in the house increased and we could hear running footsteps go up the stairs, a door slam, and it sounded like the front door would open and close, but we never saw any of the doors move. The path of the footsteps sounded like from the front door, through living room, to the bathroom, to stairs to the upstairs bungalow room. The part that really got me, was I could feel the floor impacts that felt like the vibrations of someone running past me when I was cleaning the areas. And each time I would be hit by one of those waves of fear and sadness. When we left the house there were a few people on porches hanging out like is usual during summer and the people were still hostile and yelling random things, but directed at us as we loaded the van and took off hazmat suits. We ignored this, but before we had loaded all the material from the house into the van and locked the house, the front door slammed hard enough to sound like a gunshot, which scared me and my crew member, along with the people on the front porch to the point where they went inside. The front door deadbolt was somehow locked and we could not get it open. I think it was a different key than the knob, so we ended up leaving several boards in the house that were left over from boarding a few of the windows. The feeling of relief when I left the house was like night and day. Inside I was anxious, scared, paranoid, and just really down, which could be due to knowing the story, but when I got outside, it was like flipping a light switch. I immediately felt better and me and the other guy in my crew were joking and laughing about dumb stuff and normal 19 and 20-year-old shenanigans. I have many of these stories written down in detail in a journal I started after the first 3 months of working at this job. I talked to the guys on the crews and got other strange stories from them too. I know that some of this could very well be formed by my subconscious mind to cope with traumatic situations, but some of it has no explanation, and when I hear other members of my crew tell me their stories when they haven't been influenced by mine, that is a horse of a different color. When I have time, I will pull out the journal and give more of my experiences. The job got way worse when I started the journal after 3 months in. Several experiences with what I think was paranormal, many situations that stressed my mental state to the point where my mask of sanity started to slip. In the end I worked at this place for almost 2 years, and of my crew, all died, 2 from suicides, 1 from drug overdose that could have been intentional, but we will never know. I just know that when these 3 guys, my age, around 19 and 20, started this job, all were normal well-adjusted guys with no cares in the world other than girls, parties, and working. I watched each one of them slowly drain their joys and passion for life, and I know this sounds bad, but each one that died was considerate enough to die in a clean way, most likely so another person wouldn't have to see the horrible thing that we all saw so often. Second story. This story was shared by u/Luby_Lake. Spirit possession last night had left me drained. So last night my boyfriend, we'll call him Z, and I were struggling to sleep. It was around 2:30 a.m. and we decided to use my CBD vape to try and relax us. Z was having a rough time and I was trying to comfort him. He was missing his grandpa, the only family member he has that was good to him and looked after him. I was holding him as he cried and he told me just now that in that moment he wished his grandpa was back. I didn't know that at the time. What was strange is that earlier that day, I made him toast and unbeknownst to me I made it in the exact way his grandpa made him it, the same bread, the same amount of butter even cut into the same shapes, and I did all that without even thinking. The same thing happened this morning. I made him toast the same way, but I also brought him a cherry bakewell which C informs me his grandpa used to do for him when he slept well, which he did. I got that cherry bakewell without even thinking. I feel like I'm being guided. I should prefix this with Z has a teddy bear with his grandpa's ashes inside, as it will be involved with the story. On to the actually meat of the story though. So last night I was talking about how I used to do seances as a kid for fun. My mom has always had this strange connection to the spirit world, so I always found it interesting too. I didn't realize that I might have a similar connection. This led to me and Z holding hands and asking some questions to the room, asking if Jeff, Z's grandpa, was here. We got an audio response twice, weird noises. Z was freaked out and I was trying to calm him down, saying it was fine and that his grandpa was here to guide and protect him, etc. We talked about Z's grandpa maybe having sent me to look after Z, as before he died he said he would send someone to do so eventually. I feel a strong protective urge over Z as well, so maybe. After the responses I was trying to comfort Z and help him to sleep. I was singing/humming a song his grandpa used to sing to help him sleep and stroking his hair too. Z kept telling me that I kept doing things that his grandpa used to do. At one point I laughed in the exact same way Z's grandpa used to laugh and it really freaked him out. I did a gesture where I nuzzled my head into his hair while he was humming, which Z then told me that his grandpa used to do. I felt like I was doing these things involuntarily and I couldn't stop myself. I also kept getting leg pain and cramp, which Z's grandpa really struggled with. Apparently I even responded in the same way he used to when Z asked if it was gone multiple times. I kept trying to tell myself it was all happening because we were both high, but the coincidences just kept happening and Z kept getting scared. We left the room because we were both scared and went to sleep in the other room. I was feeling weird, like I was inhabited by something. I kept doing strange out of character things and Z was scared. Z ended up trying to communicate with his grandpa again. This time he responded with my voice. When responding to Z's questions and orders, I felt like there were certain things I had to say, like the answer just came straight out and it wasn't like anything I'd say. We are pretty sure I was possessed by Z's grandpa. Z then asked his grandpa to leave and go back into the teddy. I touched the teddy and then had a weird feeling and lost my breath and started to breathe heavily. I felt like me again. This was at 5 a.m. We then went to sleep and slept really well, which is strange because we've both been really struggling to sleep in the presence of each other. This is the first time we've been able to sleep together properly in the same bed without one of us having a weird trauma response and leaving. In conclusion, it was a weird night and I'm pretty sure I was possessed. I still feel kinda weird now, but I'm not entirely sure if it was all a shared high delusion or something. If you got to the end, thank you for reading and putting up with my bad grammar. I'm very dyslexic, so apologies. Let me know what you think happened to me, and if you have any questions about the specifics, let me know. I need to talk about it. Thanks. From Lake, a 28-year-old femby from the UK. Third story. This story was shared by u/glittering, screen 318. I want to tell you a ghost story. This is actually quite long, so I hope you will stay with me. I want to tell you a ghost story, and this particular story is the reason that no one will ever be able to convince me that these things are not real. When I was 18, I met someone who was to become one of the most important and influential people in my life, ever. Some of you won't like this part, but I don't apologize for it. I don't know if it might be a pertinent part of the story or not, but I was still living at home with my mum and younger brother, my father having died when I was 15. I had been struggling for quite some time with my sexuality. I grew up in the 70s in a working-class, northern town in the UK. It was not a place to be gay in, and at 18, I still didn't know any other single person I could talk to about it, much less have any gay friends to lean on. I actually had a girlfriend then, and we had been together for 3 years by this time. It was what was expected of me, and I was desperate not to be gay. It was 1985. A great era to be just coming into adulthood. The clubs, the music, the new romantic period with Boy George, Spandau Ballet, Steve Strange and the like, all seeming to push the boundaries of what a man should be, should look like. Anyway, my girlfriend and I went out to a pub one night, and we bumped into an old school friend of mine and his girlfriend, who I also knew from school. They were both quite into the goth scene at the time, and they said that they were going to go to this club that we had never been to before, but that we knew had the reputation of being alternative, shall we say. Anyway, we agreed to come along. It was a total revelation for me, as you might imagine. Here were the people I had been looking for so long. We soon became regulars at this place. Even my girlfriend was really into it. It so happened that she actually met someone else at this club, and eventually we broke up, so no girlfriends were harmed in the making of this story. I was actually really upset by it. I had known for quite a while that I was gay, but I did love her in a way. Anyway, no matter, because I also met this person that would become so important to me, Daniel. We were only ever friends, and there were no benefits. But he was the door to my new life. Long story short, we became great friends very quickly. Within a few weeks he invited me round to a party at his house. His story is complicated. His father had also died when he was young, so I think that was another thing we bonded over. His mother had polio and was wheelchair bound. That did not stop her, however, from having 1 or 2 gentlemen callers over the years, and neither should it. About 9 months before this party, his mum's boyfriend at the time, had actually convinced his mother to move out and go live with him at his place, leaving Daniel alone in the family home. Daniel's boyfriend at the time had moved in with him soon after his mum had moved out, but they had split up recently, and so he was again alone in the house. The reason that he and his boyfriend had split up was to become clearer later, but suffice it to say, it was not just a question of compatibility. Anyway, the party was fantastic. I met all of his friends, and they were really great people, and soon we were all hanging out on an almost daily basis. I learned that Cal, his now ex, had not been able to cope with certain things that were going on in the house. They told me stories of weird noises and things being moved around or going missing. At first it was small incidents, almost not noticeable, but it soon built into more obvious and seemingly deliberate attempts to frighten the pair of them until one night, Cal had stayed up later than Dan, and on going upstairs to bed, he was pushed backwards down the stairs by something he couldn't see in front of him. That was the end of Cal being able to stay in the house, and soon after, they broke up. I had always loved ghost stories and horror films, but I didn't witness any of these happenings they talked about, and so I took it with a pinch of salt, but it was clear that Daniel didn't want to be in the house alone. There were 4 main people in our now tight-knit group: Daniel, Matt, Lucy, and me. Yes, I have changed the names because these people are mostly still alive. Lucy sadly died a few years ago of cancer, but I know she wouldn't mind me telling this story. Anyway, we took it in turns to stay overnight with Dan so that he didn't have to be alone in the house at night. The first night I stayed over, Lucy also stayed. I was a bit apprehensive, to be honest, because Dan was still reporting the odd noises and such, but it had seemed to calm down quite a bit since Cal left. The night passed uneventfully, and so too did many more nights. There were a few times that I heard something like a tapping on the wall above my bed. I thought that it was probably pipes expanding in the wall or something, but it went on for quite some time. Other little noises here and there, usually like the same tapping on the wall or odd bumps and bangs, would happen when you were in the loo, for instance, but that too could have been the pipes. We often had music on in the house, and sometimes you would hear something upstairs or in another room, but always just quiet enough to be not sure what it was, or even if you really heard it. If we turned the music down to catch it, it stopped. Being young and having this strange thing going on, we tried to make light of it, joke about it, and try scare each other in an obvious way so as to sort of normalize it, I suppose. Time passed. I had recently plucked up the courage to finally tell my mum that I was gay. She didn't take it well. I had been staying over more and more at Dan's during the last few months, and we had come, as far as my mum knew, to have some home-cooked food and for me to get some more clothes to take back to Dan's. It was spring, and believe it or not, my mum had gone into the garden to pick some daffodils for us to take back with us. Could that be more gay? LOL. Anyway, while she was out there, Dan knew that I wanted to tell her, and he said he was going to go to the shop and get some cigs so that I could talk to her without him there. I called her in, and she stood there, daffodils in hand, and I said, "Ma'am, there's something I want to tell you." "What's that?" she said. And then I froze, nothing would come out. I stuttered and stammered and started to sweat. My mum was looking at me with more and more concern until eventually I blurted out, "I'm gay." She took a deep gasp, then flung the daffodils on the floor and stormed off outside again. She came back in a minute later and said, "Well, what do you want me to do about it? Why did you tell me that? Oh, you're such a disappointment to me," and she walked off again. I wasn't quite sure what to do, but Dan came back at that point and knocked on the door. I already had the bag of stuff I wanted to take back, and so I just thought it was best to leave. I said goodbye to my mum. She wasn't crying or anything, just silently fuming, I think, in the kitchen. "Yeah," she said, and we left. Back at Dan's, having told him what had happened, he said, "Why don't you just move in here? You're already here most of the time anyway." At that point I actually thought it was a great idea, and so within a week, I had left home for the first time. My mum never really could talk freely about this side of my life, although she did try her best in later years. But it was the push that got my new life started. It was also the start of a new wave of activity at Dan's. Dan, Lucy, Matt and I were still spending almost every day together in various combinations, and either Lucy or Matt would often stay overnight too, since the house had 3 bedrooms. Lucy lived the farthest away, so she would often stay for a few days at a time. Honestly, it was a ball. One of the most fantastic times in my life. Things started to ramp up a bit though with the freaky stuff, even during the day. We had given the ghost a name. Frank. Dan and I were also actually working together at an outreach center, and we came home one afternoon, about 4 o'clock, and Dan shouted, just into the air, "Go on, Frank, give us a good bang." Instantly, there was a huge crash against the second living room door. The living room had 2 doors. One that opened onto the dining room/kitchen and one that led to the foyer before the front door. We had the sofa against that door since we didn't use it, and it sounded like someone had just kicked or punched the door as hard as they could, just once. This was not a subtle noise. We nearly jumped out of our skins and looked at each other gobsmacked. We started to laugh. It was just a shocked reaction, I think. Of course we ran to the foyer to see what had happened, but the front door was closed and there was nothing out of place and no one else in the house. It's a strange thing, but when stuff happened like that, after a few minutes, it's like you sort of start to wonder if you really heard it or not, if it really happened. We were almost never completely alone in the house, and so we always felt sort of safe in a way, having someone else to share these things with you. Of course we talked about it for a bit, but after a while we just got on with the rest of the day. There was a period of time, that every morning when we got up, the loft hatch was open. We closed it each time, but the next morning, it would be open again. That went on for a week or so. One night all of us were in the living room just talking and laughing when we heard a smash of glass from upstairs. We went running up to see what had happened, and the bulb from the bathroom light had fallen into the sink and smashed. Only, the light was in the middle of the ceiling and the sink was against the wall. Many nights I would be in bed and there was that tapping on the wall, just above the bed, for hours sometimes. In the end I learned to just ignore it and go to sleep. One night, there was another sound, outside my window. It sounded like someone was scraping a stick up and down the fence in the front yard, hitting the individual pickets. It could have easily been someone doing just that, but it went on for a couple of hours on and off. I looked out of the window, but there was a tall bush at this side of the lower wooden picket fence and I couldn't see anyone. But the next day I had a look and there were scratches along the fence. It could have been a person, but who would do that for over 2 hours at 3 in the morning? I have to confess that we did actually do a Ouija board made out of letters written on scraps of paper on the dining room table and a glass, more than once. Mostly I didn't really believe that they worked. It was almost always someone pushing it and what came out was rubbish, gibberish. But we did get a few things out of it that were a bit freaky. It seemed to accept the name Frank and said it was a friend of Dan's dad from the army. Weirdly specific. It said that he came to visit from time to time and that he was going to frighten us. Even though we mostly joked about it and treated it like it was something usual. There were small things happening almost every day, and so you do actually get used to it in a way. It was still succeeding in its mission, however, since we were all, underneath, quite frightened at times. One of the worst things that happened came also in the middle of the day. I was alone this time. Dan was at work, but it was my day off. I was just in the living room, listening to music and doing some painting. It was a bright sunny day, about 2 in the afternoon. I heard a shuffle sort of noise, again just slightly above the music. I ignored it. Again it happened, and so I turned the music off. 2 seconds later, there were footsteps, clear, almost marching footsteps coming from the room above the living room, which was Dan's bedroom. There was no carpet in that room, just painted floorboards, and it wasn't a sort of half-imagined, quickly over episode. Someone was walking in hob-nailed boots, round and round in circles in Dan's bedroom. Needless to say, I didn't go looking to see who it was. I knew I was alone in the house, and so I rather quickly left the premises and walked to work to tell Dan about it. His shift wasn't finished until 4, so I stayed there, and then we both came home. Nothing was out of place or anything. No doors or windows forced open, nor any sign that there had been anyone else in the house besides me. This next incident was a really cruel joke played on me by both Dan and Matt. I had been ill, and so when Dan and Matt asked if I wanted to come out to the club, I said no, so off they went and I stayed home, alone. It was a Friday and we didn't have work the next day, so I was up late watching some crap on the telly. At about 2:30 a.m., Dan and Matt thought it would be funny to see if they could creep in, unnoticed. They did. They both crept upstairs to Dan's room. The telly must have been quite loud, I don't know, but I never noticed them come in. The next thing I knew, there was a huge stamping of feet on the floor above me, and then a stampede of feet running down the stairs, shouting and laughing and rushing toward the living room, which at that time had the door closed. I had nowhere to go, and so I picked up a cushion and tried to jump behind the sofa. The door flew open and in rushed Dan and Matt, both quite pissed and laughing their heads off, while I was trying to jam myself between the back of the sofa and the wall with a cushion over my head. They thought it was hilarious, I did not. When they saw that I was genuinely scared shitless, they apologized profusely and said that they really hadn't planned it and that they really weren't that quiet coming in, but when they saw that I hadn't noticed them, they couldn't resist. However, only a few nights later, Dan, Lucy, and I were in our beds, maybe only about half an hour or so, when there was a huge crash from downstairs. It was quite late, as we never went to bed usually before 2 a.m. or so. The dining room was really quite large, with the kitchen at one end, the open staircase in the middle more or less, with the door to the living room opposite, and the dining table at the other end. Next to the staircase, we had a large set of shelves full of books and junk. It sounded like someone had pushed the shelves over and everything had crashed to the floor. Again, this was not a subtle half-heard event. I shouted through to Lucy, "Did you hear that?" Really, there was no way she could not have. She shouted back, "Yes." I got up and ran to her room, which was the third bedroom and full of all sorts of junk that didn't have a home anywhere else. There was a box of stuff in the corner, and among the arms that we took up were a large pot dog for Lucy and a picture frame that I broke up and made a sharp stick for me. We both then ran into Dan's room, and then all of us ventured down to see what had happened. Nothing had happened. Not a thing was out of place, but we had all heard the huge, multi-layered crash, as if lots of separate things had crashed to the floor more or less at the same time. We searched the whole house and not a thing was out of place, so eventually we made some tea and sat up a while before all going back to Dan's room and sleeping, sort of, all three of us in his bed. About an hour later, we were again disturbed by another loud crash. This time, someone ran up the stairs laughing, stopped on the landing outside the room and breathed heavily 3 times. Then nothing. The laughing was definitely laughing, but it was weirdly not human sounding. I can't really describe it better, almost as if some animal were laughing is all I can remember. We debated whether to get up and have a look or just stay put, but in the end we opened the door and crept downstairs. Again, nothing was out of place. No doors or windows unlocked and no sign that anyone had been in the house. It was about 3:30 a.m. getting on toward 4 and we didn't go back to bed that night. I lived in that house for about 2.5 years in all. I eventually met someone and moved out to live with him. I still kept in almost daily contact with Dan and Lucy and Matt, and they would still stay over at his place a lot. I felt really bad for leaving, but I also wanted to experience this new thing. It was my first real boyfriend and Dan completely understood. As I said, Lucy died recently. But we were still in touch until the end. Matt too is still a good friend. Dan, however, is a different story. Over the next few years, it became more and more difficult to deal with him. He started to become quite paranoid, and it seemed to center around me to a large degree. He told Lucy one day that I was trying to poison him and that I'd had an affair with his boyfriend. I wasn't, and I didn't, by the way. I was apparently trying to put rose fertilizer in his tea. This paranoia grew slowly over a number of years and his behavior became odder and odder. We all tried to get him to see a doctor because it was obvious that this was not normal behavior. Eventually, after quite a few years, he did actually get a diagnosis, some type of personality disorder. I know he was ill, but the damage he did to our relationship in the meantime got to such a stage where I wasn't really able to deal with it any longer, and we eventually stopped talking. I still feel bad about it to this day, but there really was nothing more I could do at the time. He wouldn't allow it. I don't know much about him now. How he is or where he is or if he's okay, if he got the help he needed. I do know he's still alive, so that's something at least. Matt also pulled away from him in the end. Dan was also quite abusive to him at times. Lucy stayed in touch longest, but even she had to withdraw in the end. I think I loved him at one point in our lives, and actually I think he loved me too, even though there was never anything sexual between us. I don't wish him any harm, but I had to put a stop to the contact for my own sake in the end. But the experience he gave me, in opening up my new life and learning to become myself, was invaluable, and the 2.5 years we spent living together were in many ways magical. Again, once I moved out, the happenings began to calm down again. They never stopped completely, but they never grew to those proportions again. But I did live it. It did happen. I often wonder if, given Dan's illness and the complicated life he led before we met, that I haven't explained but do know about, was enough to grow some kind of energy that came to life in the house. We never saw anything, it was only ever noise. The odd thing moved or disappeared or got smashed, and there was a feeling of menace a lot of the time, but never any visual apparitions. His dad died when he was young, as I said, and he did go off the rails at that time a little. His mum had polio and so was never very capable on her own. He was an accident really, and all of his brothers and sisters, of which there were 5, were quite a bit older and had left home quite some time before to begin their own lives. There were a small but steady stream of men in his mum's life that didn't always accept Dan as he was. He was quite loud and proud of who and what he was, and never hid the fact that he was gay from anyone. The man his mum eventually left him alone in the house for at 19 years old, was actually quite good with him. But I find it odd that he was not invited to go live with them, and I know my mother would never have left me alone in the house to go off and live with someone else after my dad died. That has to affect a person. I still think that the circumstances that surrounded Dan and the way we all took this phenomena and made light of it but also encouraged it in a lot of ways, might have been enough to create something. I don't know what, but whatever it was, I know it was real. It's not the only experience I've had either. When I lived in the first flat I ever had on my own, there were a couple of odd things. It was a converted old Victorian townhouse with 2 floors. I had the top floor. It really was only inches from falling apart, but I loved it. One night, I was in bed reading and the toilet flushed itself. I got up to have a look and the cistern was still filling up. It was an old Victorian toilet with the cistern high up and a long chain to pull to make it flush. The chain wasn't swinging or anything, but the water was running back into the cistern. Then on another occasion, I was in bed again and there was a crash of glass in the hallway. I got up to see what had happened and the loft hatch was actually a glass-paneled window with 6 panes. One of the panes was smashed. I cleaned it up and went back to bed. In the morning I found a stone on the stairs that must have been what broke the glass. In the slope of the roof was another glass panel. Thicker glass, but it provided light through into the attic and the stairwell. I climbed up into the attic space to see if that had been broken, but it was still intact, so where did the stone come from? The last thing that happened there was a daytime event. I was home studying in the living room. No music or telly, just me and my books. I had a big heavy mirror on the wall over the mantel and it dropped to the floor and smashed into pieces. I thought the chain that supported it must have broken or the hook had come out of the wall, and once I gathered myself together, I had a look. The chain was still intact and the hook still in the wall. Weird, eh? 4th story. This story was shared by u/personal, Pomelo 8703. I live in Utah. I'm pretty sure I had an encounter with a skinwalker or a wendigo. I am 25, M. I live in Utah and I'm curious if any of you have seen anything like this before. I'm pretty sure I saw a wendigo or a skinwalker. I know it sounds strange or crazy. I don't really believe in those things and I'm regularly skeptical when it comes to the paranormal. This happened to me when I was 17 and in high school and living with my parents. My house at the time was in a very small town. The backyard faced open empty fields and mountains for miles before you reached another civilization at all. My best friend lived next door and shared this field as our backyard in a way. I have to explain that his house was built on a different street that ended in the field with a small cul-de-sac. I think there was supposed to be more houses built down this street to expand the town, but they clearly never got around to it. So his driveway was basically in this cul-de-sac even though no other houses were built there. This matters later in the story. I used to stay the night at my friend's house a lot in high school because I didn't have the best relationship with my parents. Every once in a while we would wake up to hear dragging and a weird gargling sound from the back porch. His room was a basement room with the window well to the back porch. It would happen maybe a couple times a month, but whenever we would gather the courage to check, nothing would be back there. This happened for years. One night haunts my friend and I to this day. My friend was getting ready to move and we would stay up all night playing games and watching movies. We decided to go on a music drive to just vibe. So we hopped in his truck with high beams and swung out of the driveway, turning them on towards the field to use the roundabout. The light illuminated this thing. It looked like a person, but it wasn't. It was naked on all fours. Abnormally large, particularly its limbs that seemed to fold under itself in an unnatural way. Its pale skin clung to it like it had to be stretched onto it. But the part that still sends shivers down my spine is its face. Its jaw hung open to this gaping black maw, like a snake unhinging its jaw to eat. Its black eyes glistened in the light as it looked at us. But just as it turned to see us, it quickly scurried backwards almost like it was on rewind into the brush of the field. My friend and I were pale as ghosts. We both looked at each other like, "Did you see that too?" We were shaken. Let's just say we tried to have a good rest of the night, but we couldn't believe what we saw. We ended up just sitting there in his basement with guns ready and waiting to hear the gargling and dragging again, but we never did. Sorry that it's not very climactic, but it's the truth. I now don't live in that town anymore. There are times when I visit there though. That empty field still feels like it's watching and waiting. Even though I can't see it, I can still feel like it's out there. Fifth story. This story was shared by you/sad_ad_2051. My Skinwalker story. Before I begin, I would like to say that this is a very long story. It's been something that's haunted me since I was 6 years old, since my first encounter with it. I have had dreams about this, and 2 very specific encounters with the creature. I'm sharing this story so I could possibly find help on what to do or how to get rid of this creature that's been hunting me since I can remember. Just for background, I am a 21-year-old female and still worry about this creature finding me, but I'll get into detail why later. For now, here's my story. I would always go camping with my grandparents, who I call my Gammy and Gampy, at the end of my school years. I would always look forward to it since I grew up loving the outdoors and the woods. I especially loved camping, loving the idea of having s'mores, taking long hikes, being around the campfire, and of course the wildlife we would see. Now I grew up in California, mostly near cities, so the forest was like my true home to me. I always preferred being near trees and dirt rather than buildings and crowded places. Besides, the woods were much quieter and more peaceful. I always felt safe when I was there, like nothing could ever hurt me. But something strange would always happen at the end of the month of May. I would have this reoccurring dream during the last week of my school year. I would be in the woods, walking alone down a dirt trail. The woods were always strangely quiet. I would continue to walk this path until I saw this red fox poke its head from behind a tree. Its eyes were always strangely human-like, but they were yellow and somehow looked like teddy bear eyes, and it would just stare at me. It wouldn't make a sound at all, it would just watch me. Usually in my dream I would go up and pet it, that making the fox finally make a noise, usually a soft growl. Then I would continue walking, and it would follow me. The first time I would have this dream was when I was actually around 5 years old, and it lasted until I was about perhaps 11. Over the years it would be the same exact thing. I would walk in the woods, find this fox, pet it, then continue my hike with it alongside me. But about having this dream for the 4th time, it would start to walk behind me. That's when I started to feel uneasy about this fox. I could hear it making odd noises, but every time I went back to look, it was just walking like nothing was wrong, even, somehow, giving me a smile. Sorry to go on about a dream, but I now believe that it was a warning of the creature. Now that the dream is out of the way, I can talk about my first true encounter. I was 6 years old and was going on a camping trip with my Gammy and Gampy for about a week. Of course, I was very excited for it, being able to barely keep myself in my school seat for the last day of kindergarten. They had picked me up right as the bell had rung and already had the camping trailer attached to my Gampy's truck. I remember he drove an old red truck that only had 3 seats, me always being in the middle. It took about 2 hours to get there, and another good hour to find our usual camping spot. It was deep into the woods and far from other people, as my Gammy wasn't too fond of being around other people while we camped. As they were setting up the camping trailer, I wandered around the campsite, loving to dig in the dirt for bugs. I had sat down on the dirt and started to dig, but I noticed how strangely quiet the woods were. It was never quiet, not even in the dead of night. I thought it was odd, but being only 6, I didn't think too hard about it. As I continued to dig for bugs, however, I thought I heard my Gammy call for me. She would usually call me Sugar Booger, that being a nickname she gave me since I was born. That's what I had heard, but it sounded like she was very far away and somewhat sick. Sugar Booger. I looked up where I heard it come from, that being from the woods. But there was no way she was there, because she was still unloading stuff from the truck. Even at the age of 6, it didn't feel right, so I walked closer to my grandparents and stayed next to them. I soon forgot about my weird encounter though as we began to have fun. For the rest of that day, we played card games, sat next to the campfire as we ate dinner, and stared up into the stars. I always loved seeing the stars, there never being any where I lived at. We started to get sleepy around 9 p.m. I believe, and we started to get ready for bed. There were bunk beds that me and my Gammy would sleep on, keeping our luggage on the top bunk, and we would sleep on the bottom bunk. Due to my Gampy's snoring, he would sleep on the couch of the trailer. I would always sleep next to the trailer window just in case I couldn't sleep and wanted to look outside. I fell asleep pretty quickly though, that being the last day of school and all, it was pretty exhausting. I remember waking up maybe hours later, it still being pitch black outside. It wasn't weird for me to wake up late in the night, since I always have had sleeping issues. I rolled onto my side trying to fall back asleep, until I heard Sugar Booger. My eyes immediately shot open as I heard my nickname being spoken, but I knew it wasn't either of my grandparents. They were both asleep and never were known to sleep talk before. I started to feel this horrible feeling in my gut, like whatever I was hearing wanted to really hurt me. Even at the age of 6 I knew this wasn't normal. Then I started to hear tapping at the trailer window. It was soft, but loud enough for me to hear it. Tap tap tap. I just sat there, frozen in fear. I was trying to just brush it off as tree branches or rain, but I just knew that wasn't it. I could tell that it was really someone, or something, tapping on the window. Then I decided to be brave and look. Big mistake. I pulled the curtain away to only peek, and all I saw were these large yellow eyes. They seemed glassy, yet not entirely real. They looked like giant teddy bear eyes, but cold and unwelcoming. I remember in that moment I panicked, and quickly closed the curtain back up. I then hid under the blanket, that being the only thing I knew to do when I saw a monster. I could feel tears falling down my face. I never had been so terrified in my life. I just curled up into my Gammy's side and clung to her all night long, that damn tapping only getting louder and more persistent throughout the night. I don't remember falling asleep, but somehow, I did. I do remember my Gampy waking me up around noon, saying how if I got up quick enough, we could still go fishing. I honestly didn't want to leave the trailer at all, terrified that whatever I saw the night before would be out there. I did eventually go outside, but I was constantly looking around, horrified that whatever saw me last night would get me. My Gammy immediately knew I was scared and pulled me into a hug when she saw me, asking what was wrong. I did tell her what I saw and heard, and surprisingly, she believed me. The next thing I knew she was telling my Gampy that we were moving campsites. It took a bit to convince him, but he did eventually start to pack up and hook the trailer onto his truck. I was put into the truck so I could properly sleep, but I just couldn't. I kept feeling that I was being watched, thinking that every little noise was that thing I saw, that if I closed my eyes even for a second, it would get me. My gammy wasn't too far from me when I heard it again. But this time, it was my actual name. Ayla. In that moment, I had never seen my gammy move so fast. She looked up into the bushes where we heard it, then to me. She then got in the truck with me and pulled me into a tight, protective hug. I began to cry all over again, telling her how I wanted to just go back home. That's when my Gampy got into the truck as well, and since I was sobbing so hard to the point I was coughing, he agreed we could go home. We started to head out of the campsite, still hurt that this trip had been ruined by something. But I still didn't know what. That's when something in my head told me to look back. I slowly did so, feeling an ice-cold fear wash over me as I saw something. A red fox, sitting in the middle of the campsite, sitting there with large yellow eyes. The same red fox from my dream, somehow, curling its lips into an eerie smile. After that encounter, we never did go back to that campsite. We did continue to camp, but in more populated areas. I didn't tell my grandma what I saw, but she had told me to trust my gut. She knew that I was sensitive to certain entities, and that would help me if I trusted it. Now this would be the end of the story, but I'm afraid it isn't. There was one more encounter I had with the creature, and it was much more terrifying than the first time. The second encounter I had was when I was 17, many years later. By this time, I knew very well what a skinwalker was now, and I was still very paranoid every time I went near wooded areas. I still worried about seeing that fox, but I never really thought about it too much. Me and my two younger siblings were staying at a relative's house for Christmas, them living way up into a mountain area. I think they were my great aunt and uncle, but I'm not sure. Where they lived, there was no service at all, so unless we hooked up onto their Wi-Fi, we had no phones. I didn't mind the house, still loving the woods no matter what happened. Although at night I hated how they didn't close the window curtains, making it easy to anything outside to see inside. But I did feel safe while inside the house, knowing that they wouldn't let anything hurt us kids. Luckily it didn't snow where they lived, so we could go outside and run around. They also had this beautiful black lab, being about a year old, named Pam. She was very playful and normally wouldn't listen to anyone but my uncle. Although she was easily excitable, she was a good puppy. One of the days we were there, my little sister and our aunt went out to the store for a nice girls' day. Although I'm a girl, I wanted to go hiking with my uncle and my little brother. We left pretty early since the hike we were doing was 4 hours of walking into town. It was a really chilly morning, but since we were doing so much walking, it felt great. We also decided to take Pam, it being a good way for her to get exercise and have fun. About maybe an hour into our walk, I started to slow down a bit, wanting to enjoy the beautiful forest. It was so peaceful, I could have honestly stayed there. But as we continued to walk, I started to feel something odd. I noticed how quiet the forest had suddenly become, hearing only our footsteps and my brother talking to our uncle. Pam noticed it too, her ears going straight up and growling softly. I started to pick up my pace to get next to my brother, worried that possibly a coyote or mountain lion was nearby. I knew though that they wouldn't be out at this time though, even if they were they didn't walk near the roads. My little brother was only 9 at that time, and being the oldest sibling, my natural instincts to protect him kicked in. My uncle noticed the silence as well, telling us to stay close to him and Pam, who was now next to me and still growling. I began to feel that horrible feeling again, that ice-cold fear I once felt when I was 6. I tried so hard to not think of the creature, but it was all I could worry about. I was scared. I felt like I was back to being that scared little 6-year-old girl again. I had to stop for a moment though, seeing my shoelace came undone. I quickly kneeled down to tie it back up, trying to hurry and just get out of there. That's when I heard it. Alea. In that moment, my heart dropped into my stomach. My eyes were widened and I could just feel myself start to shake from fear. It was right next to me. I heard it clear as day. I slowly turned my head, and there it was. That same red fox, still having those horrid yellow eyes, and that same demented smile. Only this time I saw it much more clearly. Its fur looked so matted and disgusting, the smell it had was like rotten, decaying flesh mixed with garbage. Its limbs were much too long for a normal fox, the back legs bending completely the wrong way. Those eyes were still the worst thing about it, but now they looked emptier than I had remembered. I wanted to scream, to run, to cry, but I just couldn't. I was frozen as I was, too scared to even blink. Then I heard it speak again. This time however, it had mimicked my little brother's voice. Found you. Before anything else could happen, Pam suddenly jumped in front of me and started to bark like mad, snapping and growling so aggressively that it scared me out of my frozen trance. When I looked back, it was gone. I used that moment to run over to my brother and uncle, who didn't see what I saw as they were too far ahead now. But I heard my uncle start to pray and sing a song under his breath, keeping my brother and myself close to him. I was just too scared to even look back, so I just kept my eyes on the ground and refused to stop walking. Pam had stopped barking, but she was still loudly growling and never left my side as we continued our hike. My little brother was a bit worried, but he just thought it was a coyote. When we finally made it into town, my uncle had called our aunt and told her to pick us up, saying something about how it wasn't safe for us to walk back. Thankfully she did come and get us, but she was confused since we talked about that hike for days. On the car ride back, Pam never left me alone. She was right with me the entire time. She knew that thing was after me, and she protected me. I was very grateful that she was with us. Who knows what would have happened if she wasn't. When we got back to the house, I was taught to by my uncle and aunt. Once I told them what happened and what I saw, they had started to pray and check that all the locks were shut tight, my aunt putting something around the doors. I now believe it was probably ashes, but I never did find out. Unfortunately, this made our Christmas vacation cut short, as they were worried that I was not safe while still in the woods. We had to be taken home the next day, them making an excuse of how there was an emergency with a friend and that they had to help them out. I felt horrible that this Christmas was ruined, but once I did leave the woods, I truly felt safe again. Before they had to drive back home though, they told me that it wasn't my fault, and that luckily it didn't hurt me or the other kids. It did make me feel a bit better, but it still brought up a lot of questions and worries. It was still around. How? Why? What did it want with me? Does it want my skin? My soul? Was I just going to be tormented by this thing forever? I still don't have answers to these questions, and that's what really scares me. Now, I've long moved from California and now live in Kentucky. I do live in woods, but so far, that thing hasn't found me. I know that seems very stupid on my part, but life had changed a lot when I was growing up. I was given no other option to live somewhere else, and my grandpa in KY was kind enough to let me live with him, so please don't call me an idiot for moving to the woods when I had no other choice. Anyways, while I am happy it hasn't found me, I'm still worried. Can it still find me? Is it still hunting me? I'm not close to anyone who knows truly on how to get rid of this thing, and that's why I'm telling my story now so I can possibly find help. So please, if there's anyone out there who does know, help me. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.